In today's video, we are going to talk about muscle. We're going to spend the majority of the time talking about skeletal muscle, but we will introduce cardiac and smooth muscle too. So, the functions of our muscle tissue, as you probably know, are for generating movement. We are able to move our bodies because of our muscle, thank goodness. Our voluntary movement is a specific type of muscle, but then we also have other muscle, as shown down here, that store and move substances. For example, our food through our GI tract, our blood through our blood vessels, or our urine through our bladder and urethra. A byproduct of this movement of skeletal muscle as well as smooth muscle is heat. Heat is a byproduct, it's produced from these reactions. And so, if you go running after 10 minutes, your body warms up and gets warmer. And another thing that one may not think of with muscle is that it assists in maintaining posture. And that is strictly by the structure of muscle, by muscle tone. What that means is muscle at rest provides some support. So we've only been talking about epithelium and connective tissue, and now we have muscle tissue, and it's very different from those different tissue types. Muscle is excitable, which means it can change, it can respond to stimulation. And how it responds, it contracts. And when we say contract, what that really means is it gets shorter. This is a big thing for you to remember when you're learning about the action of our skeletal muscles. One awesome thing about our muscle is that it can extend. It is extensible, which means it can stretch without damage. But then what is great about our muscle is that it is also elastic. And you should know this term by now. Elastic means that it can stretch, but then it can return to its original shape. So before we get into our skeletal muscle, let's talk about cardiac and smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart. That's why it's called cardiac. And it is an involuntary muscle. Of course, we don't have to think about contracting our cardiac muscle. Thank goodness. Its job is to pump blood. And what you're going to see in lab is the way it looks is that it is striated, meaning it has these stripes, and it is branched. And so if you can see this one, I'm outlining it right here. This shows you one cell, and it shows you it kind of breaks off like a Y. That's what we mean by branched. This is unique. This is unique to cardiac muscle. And then notice it's one cell, one nucleus per cell. Cardiac muscle is also something that a lot of people don't know or think about. It's myogenic. And so we're going to see this prefix a lot, myo, and that just means muscle. We should now know that genic means beginning. And so what this means is that the muscle can begin contraction itself. So cardiac muscle is special. It's myogenic. The muscle contracts itself. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, is called smooth because it has no striations. And to me, they just look like little worms. Like if I were to just draw them, I would just draw it like this, And we find them around our organs, like our uterus, around our blood vessels, around our intestines, for example. And it has various actions, but really it's all about movement too. Perhaps it's going to do peristalsis, which is going to help move food through our GI tract. Perhaps it'll help move blood through our blood vessels. It is also single nucleated, so one nucleus per cell. And again, this is involuntary action. We do not have to think about moving food through our GI tract, right? Thank goodness. And then notice here it says neurogenic and some myogenic. Neuro means the brain. So what this means is that our brain initiates this contraction. So the majority of the time, our smooth muscle is controlled by our central nervous system, but there are some smooth muscle that are myogenic. And then the last one here that we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about is skeletal muscle. It's called skeletal muscle because it's attached to the skeleton. And this is voluntary movement. This is what we think of, or this is what we are aiming to, work on when we go to 24-hour fitness. They notice what they look like. There are those striations again. And so if I'm going to outline one cell for you, this would be one cell. They are big, and they can be long too. So this doesn't even show one whole cell, right? This is one cell. And then one thing about them is that notice there are, I covered up all the nuclei, but notice that there are multiple nuclei per cell. So these are big fibers. We call them fibers here. We don't call them cells because they're so big. And again, notice that it says neurogenic here, which means our brain controls the action here. And of course, these are voluntary, so we know that our brain controls these. So we're going to discuss the structure of skeletal muscle. And you can think of skeletal muscle as an organ. It contains all these different tissue types: muscle tissue, connective tissue to organize them, and then blood vessels and nerves around them as well. So there are 3 connective tissue layers that surround our muscle. So here we have a picture of bone, and here we have a whole muscle. This is a whole muscle. There is a connective tissue layer around the whole muscle called the epimysium. This whole muscle is made out of bundles, and one of these bundles is called a fascicle. These fascicles can be observed in, tearing chicken, or when you cut a steak, like the grain of a steak. When you see those grains, that is fascicles that you see. And so a muscle is a collection of these fascicles. You pull one of these fascicles out, and they are covered by a connective tissue layer called perimysium. And then if you look at the inside of a whole fascicle, here again we have a whole fascicle. They are made out of bundles, and I'm going to outline one. And these bundles, one of these is one muscle cell. So one of this is one muscle cell. But here we don't call them cells anymore because they're so specialized and different. We call them fibers. So this is one muscle fiber. There is a connective tissue layer here surrounding one muscle fiber, and that is called the endomysium. What's interesting here is that the endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium all extend past the length of your muscle, and that is actually what produces our tendon that attach our muscle to bone. We've zoomed in here, and here we have one muscle fiber, and we're going to talk about some of these different structures that we find in here. So notice the endomysium would have been out here, and so we're looking deep to the endomysium, right? Because this is connective tissue. Here we have the cell membrane called the sarcolemma. So I said earlier, you're going to see the prefix myo. You're also going to see the prefix sarco. These mean muscle. So again, a muscle fiber is so specialized that the cell membrane is not just called the cell membrane or plasma membrane. It's called something special. It's called the sarcolemma because you're going to see that it has a specific job. And in fact, it does have these interesting structures where it invaginates in, so it folds in here. And these are called transverse tubules because they fold on a transverse plane. So T tubules for short. And what this really does is it allows for an action potential to travel quickly through a muscle fiber. Around our transverse tubule, notice that there's like these orange gates. This is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Notice it's not called the endoplasmic reticulum here, but the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It is kind of like the endoplasmic reticulum, but its one job is to store calcium. Notice we have multi-nuclei here. 1, 2, or 3 are shown in this image. We have mitochondria. What are their function? And then we have these long myofibrils bundles. And these are going to be what contract when we contract our muscles. They're going to be what shorten when we contract our muscle. The cytoplasm of the muscle fiber is not called the cytoplasm. It's special. It has different things in it, so it's called the sarcoplasm. Inside the sarcoplasm, you have different components that you wouldn't find in a typical cell. For example, of course, we'd find mitochondria. It's very abundant because we're going to use a lot of ATP in our muscle fibers. We find those myofibrils that are going to contract. We'll talk about more of those in just a second. And then we find these two different molecules. Myoglobin. Sounds a lot like hemoglobin, but again, myo means muscle, so it's found in muscle. And it does the same thing as hemoglobin. It's going to store oxygen, except that it's found in muscle now. And then we have glycogen. Glycogen, if you can remember, is our storage form, if you can remember from general bio, is long-term storage of glucose. And in our muscle cells, it provides energy for our muscle tissue. Let's look closer at our myofibrils. And you'll see that they are made of these thick and thin lines, which we call thick and thin filaments. The thick filaments are made out of a protein called myosin, whereas the thin filaments are made out of 3 proteins called actin, tropomyosin, and troponin. And these are called thick and thin filaments because if you look at them beneath the microscope, they literally look thick and thin. And from Z line, as you can see here, it's called a Z line because it actually looks like Z's. From Z line to Z line, this is what we define as one sarcomere. And so a sarcomere is going to be a collection of these thick and thin filaments. And this is actually what is going to get shorter. So we said our myofibril gets shorter, but the sarcomere on the myofibril is what gets shorter. So thick filaments are made out of myosin. I like to say that they look like golf clubs, and they look like a bunch of golf clubs just spun around each other. The part of the golf club that hits the ball is called the myosin head, whereas the handle would be considered the myosin tail. And for the thin filament, we have actin, which is really attracted to myosin, wants to bind to myosin. But its myosin binding site is covered up by this orange rope called tropomyosin. And then troponin is the blue balls that control where the tropomyosin rope goes. And by the way, all 4 of these, actin, tropomyosin, troponin, myosin, they're all proteins. This is why eating protein is important for muscle building. So we're going to look closer at where the muscle meets the neuron, because we said that skeletal muscle is neurogenic. Quick introduction of a typical neuron. You don't need to know these parts for now, but all we want to know is that it sends a signal. It sends a signal, and it sends it in a one-way street. So it's going to go from the dendrites here, past the cell body, and then down the length of the axon, and the signal is going to kind of come out of these axon terminals. And then this is where it's going to communicate with skeletal muscle. So our somatic motor neurons are going to supply that innervation to our skeletal muscle. And again, we'll talk about that more when we talk about our nervous system. But they're going to meet up with our skeletal muscle, and they're going to basically touch them at these areas called axon terminals. And they're going to communicate with our skeletal muscle by releasing chemicals called neurotransmitters. An action potential, which is basically just a signal, is going to come down the length of our axon, spit out neurotransmitter of our synaptic terminal, and that specific neurotransmitter that excites all skeletal muscle is called acetylcholine. This is really important. You're going to learn more about this in human physiology, but this is just an introduction for now. So acetylcholine is released from these somatic motor neurons. They're going to be released. They're these red triangles here. And then they're going to spread into the small cleft that's between our synaptic terminal and our skeletal muscle. And then it's going to bind onto our skeletal muscle. And what that does is it causes sodium to rush into our skeletal muscle fiber. This continues happening until the acetylcholine neurotransmitter goes away. And so there's an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase that breaks apart acetylcholine. And acetylcholine actually gets recycled back into the axon terminal for reuse. So what happens when you get Botox? Botulinum toxin is a toxin that's produced by a bacteria. It's also marketed as Botox, and what it does is it inhibits the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction.